I am a freak for Mervyn Peake. I know this channel is normally about George R.R. Martin and the Ice and Fire books, but don't worry, George loves Peake too, and so should you. He wrote the Titus books, or Gormenghast, a seminal work in literary fantasy from the mid-20th century. Peake was a contemporary of Tolkien, working on his Titus series as Tolkien was making Lord of the Rings. Now, which of these British literary geniuses is more famous? That's obvious. Tolkien set the modern standard for fantasy. It's the benchmark every contemporary fantasy is compared to, especially George Martin. They even call George the American Tolkien. But what Mervyn Peake did in the Titus books was completely fresh at the time and really hasn't been imitated in the decades since. These books are commercial darlings, but these went out of print shortly after publication, only to be re-released as the years go by, as the weird, niche fantasy series found its weird, niche fanbase. As John Watney puts it in his Peake biography, if anyone ever lived out of his time, it must surely have been Mervyn Peake. Had he lived earlier or later, he would have found appreciative audiences. As it was, his own generation largely ignored him. I'm not about trying to convince you to read these books. If you're into weird shit and you can appreciate a 500,000-word glimpse into an artist's psyche, then read them. Its scale isn't as big as Ice and Fire, but it cares just as much about exploring the human condition and the heart in conflict with itself. Peake's way of going about it, though, is like if an alien watched a History Channel documentary and then tried to write a novel. During the Second World War, while actively serving in said war. It's fucking awesome. But I'll mainly be focused on the deterioration of Peake's mind, how it manifested in his Titus series, and why, for different reasons of course, I'm curious what it would look like if George R.R. Martin decided to wrap up A Song of Ice and Fire in a single volume, the same way Gormenghast did. Mervyn Peake was born in 1911 China and died in 1968 England. He was only 57 years old. His official cause of death was Parkinson's disease, which he was diagnosed with in 1958, 10 years before his death. There's been speculation, though, that Mervyn suffered from the sleeping sickness. This was a gruesome epidemic that swept over China in 1916, while young Mervyn was living in Tientsin as the child of an English doctor missionary. He had bronchitis around this time, but perhaps it was simply a mild case of sleeping sickness, which lay dormant inside his body for another 40 years before ruining his life. Symptoms of encephalitis lethargica include delayed mental and physical response time, sleep inversion, tremors, and psychosis, all of which Mervyn experienced by the late 50s. But the more likely answer is that Peake simply died of Parkinson's disease and dementia with Lewy bodies, a diagnosis that didn't really come into vogue until the 70s and 80s, years after Peake's death. I recommend this extremely insightful article by Dr. DJ Salas from 2003. It covers everything I just said in way more depth. Part of Mervyn Peake's treatment plan was electroconvulsive therapy, because doctors in the 1950s were a lot stupider than doctors today. I guess that's how time works. From the hospital, he would write to his wife, Maeve Gilmore. More than anything before, I want you now. It is beyond falling in love. It is a yearning such as I have never known before, making me quite ill and sick. There is something here which I suppose will cure me, but there is something that makes me want to vomit. I have almost lost my identity. I long for your white arms around my neck. The male nurses are pleasant, but I am afraid of something subtler. It is the smell of this place, its miles and miles of corridors, the expression on the faces of some of whom have been here for years. The only thing shock therapy did was make Mervyn worse, which reminds me of another poet and novelist working at the same time, only across the Atlantic Ocean. Sylvia Plath was treated for depression with electric shock therapy a few years before Peake received it for Parkinson's. Her experience led to suicide attempts and is tragically but beautifully retold in The Bell Jar. Just as Peake described shock therapy as losing my identity, Plath writes in The Bell Jar, I felt dumb and subdued. Every time I tried to concentrate, my mind glided off, like a skater, into a large empty space and pirouetted there absently. Earth lost two of its greatest literary geniuses in the same decade, for two completely different disorders of the brain after having received the same worthless treatment. The Titus books are a trilogy. The fourth I'll discuss later on. Peake wrote Titus Groan during World War II, while he was failing to be helpful to the British military. That came out in 1946, its sequel Gormenghast in 1950, and Titus Alone in 1959. As he was writing Titus Alone, Maeve tried her best to type up his manuscript. It was full of emendations, deletions, and alternative scenes, and the handwriting progressively deteriorates. For context, this is Peake's handwriting before the Parkinsons. Shout out Maeve Gilmore. Titus Alone was meant to be a jumping-off point in the series rather than a conclusion. Titus was finally out on his own, away from the oppressive rituals of home, and Peake wanted to continue writing Titus stories for the rest of both of their lives. By no means was Titus Alone meant to conclude the series, even if it does have a relatively satisfying ending. At this stage of Peake's health decline, it was mostly his body that was failing him, tremors and symptoms of Parkinson's. His mind was still lucid, and Titus Alone is filled with intentional allegories to the horrors of Peake's own experience. Shortly after its liberation, Peake visited the concentration camp at Belsen to record pictures of the victims. The evil of the place understandably lodged itself into Peake's mind. Of his famous illustration of the dying girl at Belsen, Peake wrote, "If seeing her an hour before her last weak cough into all blackness, I could yet be held by chalk-white walls, and by the great ash-colored bed, and the pillows hardly creased by the tapping of her little cough-jerked head, if such can be a painter's ecstasy, her limbs like pipes, her head a china skull, then where is mercy?" Essentially, he felt guilty for exploiting human trauma for the sake of his own art, but sometimes the best art comes from horrible experiences that people go through. Michael Moorcock, a famous writer in his own right, responsible for the Elric stories, which I've made a video about a long time ago, was a sort of disciple of Peake towards the end of his life, when Moorcock was an up-and-comer. He said that Titus Alone tried to tackle issues of modernity, world conflict, the Cold War, nuclear weapons, authoritarianism, all sprouting like weeds from the old world. The old world in this case being the confines of Gormenghast. Titus Alone features a factory for human suffering, green smoke, gray sludge, putrefaction, a machine that inflicts pain with the flick of a switch, an endless, impalpable sound that, had it been translated into a world of odors, might have been likened to the smell of death, a kind of sweet decay. Yorke argues that this all comes from Peake's visit to Belsen, as well as the more personal horrors he felt in the various mental institutions that failed to cure him. Titus manages to escape this adventure, and the book closes with him venturing off into the unknown. For Titus, as though shaking off the past from his shoulders like a heavy cape, began to run down the far side of the mountain, not by the track by which he had ascended, but by another that he had never known before. With every pace he drew away from Gormenghast Mountain, and from everything that belonged to his home. The fourth book was meant to be, and still sort of is, Titus Awakes. At the very end of my omnibus copy here, they printed a list of characters and events Peake had in his notes for future Titus books. They even published the beginning of Book 4, with a note saying that everything beyond that was too difficult to decipher. Mervyn Peake lost his battle to Parkinson's and dementia, but his wife, Maeve Gilmore, resolved to continue Titus's story. Maeve was a brilliant artist in her own right, though mostly a fine artist. She had plenty of exhibitions of her own work, even if her husband was more famous. She met Mervyn as a college student, taking one of his art classes, and essentially put her career on hold to raise their family and support Mervyn's work. With Mervyn gone, she wanted to pay tribute to his genius by concluding his most famous work. She wrote Titus Awakes throughout the 70s, using only this same snippet of Mervyn's own writing that was published in my omnibus here. It makes up the first chapter of Titus Awakes, and from then on, it's completely Maeve's story. She shelved the project and never got it published, but her granddaughter discovered the manuscript in an attic only in 2010, and it was published a year later. After reading Titus Awakes, it's clear that Maeve wanted to finish Titus's story for good, rather than picking up where Mervyn left off and trying to write the rest of Titus's life herself. She did this by essentially putting Titus Groan through the same sequence of horrors and life experiences that Mervyn Peake had, and at the end of the book, Titus literally metamorphoses into Mervyn Peake. He arrives on a small island that's obviously Sark, a place of huge importance in Peake's life where he lived intermittently. Titus meets a man there, a younger Mervyn himself, who has a house, a wife, little children. To them, life was for living, and as Titus watched this man, whom he knew as himself, the same virtue displayed itself. What he understood was a lust for life. The excitement of that life transmitted itself into the little girl, and to 2 young boys who joined the group. Titus had reached an anchorage. He knew that his past and his future, his whole being, his reason, were here. Titus becomes this man, and the book ends, "There is not a road, not a track, but it will lead him home." Maeve is doing a callback to Titus's mother Gertrude, her final words to him in Book 2. "There is nowhere else. You will only tread a circle, Titus Groan. There is not a road, not a track, but it will lead you home. For everything comes to Gormenghast." Of course, Maeve landed Titus on Sark, not back in Gormenghast, which I'll discuss in a bit. So at the end of Titus Awakes, Maeve literally fused Titus Groan into Mervyn Peake, but I'd argue that Titus had always been a self-insert. Mervyn gave Titus all these traits and desires and odd qualities that harken to his own. Gormenghast is dominated by ritual. The Groans are mandated by ancient tradition every day to perform little ceremonies and superstitions. He was by now so used to ceremonies of one kind or another that the idea of having to spend his birthday either performing or watching others perform some time-hardened ritual made no appeal to his imagination. And then, "What's that for?" said Titus, eyeing the scarf. "It's part of the ceremony, lordship. You have to be blindfolded." "No," shouted Titus. "Why should I be?" "It's nothing to do with me," said the man. "It's the law." "The law, the law, the law. How I hate the law," cried the boy. "Why does it want me blindfolded after keeping me in prison all day? Where are you going to take me? What's it all about? Can't you talk? Can't you talk?" Titus was only 10 in this excerpt, but already yearning to break free. On his very first night at boarding school, Mervyn Peake got beaten by a prefect, who happened to be his older brother Leslie, for talking with his roommate. It was his initiation into a whole new and rather brutal protocol, against which he offended many times. Titus offended protocol by running off into the woods and befriending the exiled Mr. Flay, and by becoming obsessed with the Thing, his foster sister who was orphaned and basically turned into Tarzan. Titus is resistant to commands and containment. He needs freedom above all else. His punishment for escaping castle grounds is to spend a week in a big cube called the Lichen Fort. Mervyn was so uneasy by the confines of his army camp, plus his inability to do anything useful, that he was removed from the barracks and placed in his own lean-to, away from the rest of his company. After shedding his school uniform, Peake had expressed his singularity by a decade of flamboyant dressing with his lurid ties, vivid socks, earring, and flowing hair, but now he was back to doing as he was told. On his first parade, he was ordered by the sergeant to get his hair cut. "You look like a bloody poet," he said, to which Peake replied, "That is exactly what I am," an answer which would not make his barrack life any easier. A master of oil painting, charcoal drawings, line illustrations, poetry, novels, playwriting, Mervyn Peake was somebody who had to be able to express himself. It was mandatory for his life on Earth. So too was it mandatory for Titus, who eschews his rigid schedule in the classrooms to chase after the Thing, envious of her ultimate freedom. So, in short, Maeve was exactly correct, and was probably told by Mervyn himself that Titus Groan was always a self-insert by the author. My only critique of Maeve Gilmore's Titus Awakes is that she puts sentimentality before what's good for the story. The whole book is a love letter to Mervyn. She began writing it in 1970, just 2 years after his death. It was somewhat of a coping mechanism to deal with the grief, and a way to immortalize Mervyn and remember him. But her ending, with Titus seeking a boat to travel across the ocean, and his exultant arrival on Sark, where he can find his own personal peace, I don't think it was right for the story. Now I'll bring back Countess Gertrude's remark at the end of Book 2. "There is nowhere else. You will only tread a circle, Titus Groan. There is not a road, not a track, but it will lead you home. For everything comes to Gormenghast." For Maeve, Titus's home becomes Sark, becomes the Peake family. But Gormenghast is Titus's home, and it feels unsatisfying to me that Titus concludes his story without reckoning with his youth there. His emotionless mother, the vacant throne, tragic memories with his sister Fuchsia, his fight with Steerpike. Titus's whole thing was that he hated the restrictions of Gormenghast. Wouldn't the ultimate conclusion then have Titus go back to Gormenghast after so many years, and as the self-exiled Earl of Groan, he could reform it, break down the barrier between castlefolk and the Carvers, put an end to the endless rituals and pointless ceremonies, and make Gormenghast into a better place, a place he can call home, even connect it with the outside world that he explored in Titus alone, and that he would have explored in all those future stories that Mervyn Peake never got to write. To reform is more of an achievement than to escape, in my opinion. Daenerys Targaryen is a hero because she doesn't escape. She has every opportunity to hop on a ship and begin her reclamation of Westeros, but she decides to stay in Slaver's Bay and reform, to put an end to evil and make a better life for all. Titus put an end to evil when he killed Steerpike, I suppose, but he never made a better life there. So this brings me to A Song of Ice and Fire. What mistakes would George Martin need to avoid if, hypothetically, he wanted to conclude his series in just one volume? Before you yell at me, I assure you that I can see the difference between Gormenghast and A Song of Ice and Fire. Maeve Gilmore had to conclude the series in one book because her husband got too sick to continue on with it. George Martin is just stuck. Whether it's perfectionism, procrastination, or a little of both and plenty else, something is keeping George from finishing the last 2 volumes. Also, the Titus books are about Titus. He is the main character who the story revolves around. A Song of Ice and Fire has at least 5 main characters, Daenerys, Jon, Bran, Arya, and Tyrion, who are all hundreds or perhaps thousands of miles away from each other. Not to mention the fact that George Martin really hasn't at all set up what figures to be the central villain of the story, the Others. We get a glimpse of them in the prologue, another few glimpses, bits and pieces of lore, but basically zero development of that plotline. What do they want? Why are they on the move now after being dormant for centuries? Where are they going? Is it Winterfell? Further south? 3 of those 5 main characters don't even know the Others are a threat right now. So how in the world could George possibly wrap up A Song of Ice and Fire in one book? Here's where all our major characters are at the current point in the story. Safe to assume that everyone on the eastern continent will need to travel to Westeros for the climax. Victarion should probably die in the Battle of Fire after helping Barristan and Selmy win. We need to trim down the Greyjoys, and Euron will mean more to the story than Victarion. Maybe his Dragonhorn binds Viserion or Rhaegal to Euron before he dies, but he's dying before he can ever meet Dany and steal her from Euron. Barristan could die in the battle too, since we'll have Dany and Tyrion as POV characters, but he could also just go back to being a non-POV once Dany returns. Dany, in just a chapter or 2, will need to take revenge on Jaqo and Mago and display her power to the Khalasars gathered in Vaes Dothrak. Now having gone back there, she can move forward with her army. A chapter or 2 cleaning up the loose ends in Meereen, and by loose ends, I mean the slave masters' rectums, and redistributing their wealth to get the former slaves back on their feet and reform their economy. A trip to Volantis probably, to liberate the slaves there, as foreshadowed by the Widow of the Waterfront, and perhaps Braavos and or Pentos to reckon with Illyrio and her dreams of the House with the Red Door. Obviously, this thought experiment demands that George write not necessarily at a quicker pace, but that he cuts out travel time and anything superfluous to the story, and simply passes more time within each chapter. Plenty of other books pass days, weeks, maybe even months just by skipping a line and starting a new paragraph. Arya's up in Braavos where she kills Raff the Sweetling according to her Win sample chapter. George has said before, in 2005 after he nixed the 5-year gap, that if a 12-year-old has to conquer the world, then so be it. Well, Arya's 11, almost 12, but I doubt she's going to conquer the world. She'll simply overhear at the docks how the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch has been murdered, or she'll even run into Jane Poole if Justin Massey takes her with him to the Free Cities. And Arya will decide that, after all, she isn't no one, and she'd like some vengeance for all her dead family. Off west she goes. This could honestly be done in a single chapter, but 2 is plenty. The southern conflicts can be concluded real swiftly if George wanted to. Condense the Arianne sample chapters so that Aegon's taken Storm's End by Arianne 1, he meets the Reach army led by Randyll Tarly in Jon Connington 1, and decides to strike a deal with the Reach, marry Arianne to secure Dorne, and ride west to fight Euron in or around Oldtown to prove his worth as a Targaryen king. By Jon Connington 2, Aegon can either die at the hands of Euron, or die trying to wrest King's Landing from Cersei after defeating Euron. For maximum efficiency, Euron would blow Sam's Horn of Winter during his cataclysm at Oldtown before dying and warging into a kraken for good. So the wall falls, or at least part of it, as Aegon gets crowned in the Starry Sept just like that other Aegon 300 years ago. It's like poetry, it rhymes. And he heads to King's Landing where Cersei rings the bells to trigger Jon Connington's PTSD from the Battle of the Bells where he lost to Robert. And Jon Con either intentionally or inadvertently sets off a bunch of wildfire, killing himself and Aegon and a bunch of people. All of this can happen in a few Arianne chapters and a few Jon Con chapters. Probably a Cersei chapter too. In the Riverlands, you've got Brienne and Jaime versus Lady Stoneheart. The most satisfying option, I think, is that Brienne defends Jaime in a trial by combat, thus bringing Jaime's whole Oathbreaker versus Oathkeeper conundrum to a head by breaking her oath to Catelyn for the sake of doing the right thing, just as Jaime broke his oath to Aerys to do the right thing. I like to imagine Jaime leading the Brotherhood and Brienne north for the long night, fulfilling his Weirwood Stump dream in which he and Brienne face the darkness together. And you could even lump Arya in with them if her ship from Braavos lands her in Maidenpool. She reunites with Nymeria and her wolf pack, maybe gives her mother a mercy killing, and heads north to deal with the mutineers for what they did to Jon. This can all happen in a couple Brienne chapters and an Arya chapter. Alternatively, lots of folks think Jaime is the Valonqar who must choke the life out of Cersei, so maybe he'll go back to her around the same time as the battle against Jon Con, and the wildfire will be Cersei's fault, and Jaime kills her just as he killed the Mad King before heading north. In the north, we have Davos, Asha, Theon, Bran, and Jon. Asha is our Stannis POV for the moment. Theon might have served out his usefulness by freeing fake Arya, and could be killed relatively soon. Bran is probably the character giving George the most fits since he's tied into the others' plot, and Jon needs to be resurrected and restore Winterfell to House Stark. What's the most efficient way to deal with all of this and get the story to a climax? Stannis beats Roose Bolton, but Ramsay escapes. Stannis goes back to the wall just as the others are bearing down on it, and he sacrifices Shireen to wake a stone dragon. That stone dragon is Jon, who takes revenge on his killers before leading a wildling army south to kill Ramsay. Davos brings Rickon, and perhaps some Skagosi and the wildlings they save at Hardhome off-screen, to Winterfell, where he meets Jon and begins serving him now because Stannis went insane after murdering Shireen for no good reason and has now become the Night's King at the Night Fort. Or whatever. Bran needs to learn more green-seeing magic from Bloodraven until the others find their cave, at which point Hodor will ferry them away through the tunnels and sacrifice himself in his hold the door moment, which, according to George himself, is more of a hold the past moment in the books. All of this can happen in a couple Asha chapters, a Davos chapter, maybe one more Theon chapter, probably 3 Jon chapters, and a couple Bran chapters. I mean, you could even do it in one Bran chapter if you push it until the end of the first half of the book. I haven't forgotten about Sansa. In the Vale, I'd like to see her outwit Littlefinger, or perhaps take advantage of his creepy, Lolita-esque attraction to her and come into some power of her own for the first time in her life. By exposing Littlefinger's plot to kill Sweet Robin and pull the puppet strings of a Sansa-Harry the Heir marriage, or even taking Sansa for his own wife and ruling the Vale outright, Sansa will shed her Elaine disguise and reveal herself to the lords and ladies of the Vale. As Sweet Robin's cousin, the niece of their late Lady Lysa, the Knights of the Vale will pledge their swords to see Sansa safely home to Winterfell. I do think all the Stark kids, plus Davos, Jaime, Tyrion, Daenerys, etc., will reunite in Winterfell before the conflict with the others begins. Game of Thrones got that right, or they got it from George. The logistics of how all these characters get to the climax can make for some great YouTube fodder. I mean, I've done several hours of Winds of Winter predictions videos, but the truth is, in a universe where A Song of Ice and Fire ends in one book, All of this is just busy work to get us from the current point of the story to the climax. There are so many options for each character's movements that it's basically choose your own adventure until they all meet up in Winterfell for the climax. I've given you some scenarios I like, but I'm sure you'll disagree with a bunch of them, so I'd love to hear your predictions in the comments. For this thought experiment, a universe where George ends his series in one volume, we have to ask ourselves, what are the utmost important themes, through lines, and foreshadowings that need to be paid off by the end of the story? Recall my example of Gormenghast and Gertrude's final words to Titus. Those words never came true because his road never brought him back to Gormenghast. It left me feeling a bit unsatisfied, and we need to avoid that in A Song of Ice and Fire. I'll focus on the central five, the characters who George mentioned in his very first outline as being his most important, or whatever. Daenerys is concerned with liberating those who cannot liberate themselves. Coming into her own power after being abused and sold, she wants to use that power to prevent others from becoming property like she was. Freeing the slaves of Essos, despite how difficult it's been for Dany, is just a preamble. By the end of the story, Dany should help save all of humanity from the others, ice demons who enslave all the people they murder using necromancy. It's a good thing the Whites can die by fire, considering Dany has 3 sentient flamethrowers who can liberate humanity and the Whites from the others, who Tormund even calls masters in Book 5. George is literally telling us that Dany has more masters to kill. And let us not forget George's brilliant foreshadowing from the House of the Undying. Daenerys sees a corrupted blue heart surrounded by blue shadows. Then she sees a blue-eyed king who cast no shadow. And then after the Undying ones start clinging to her, who, by the way, are described with zombie-like indigo flesh and blue eyes just like Whites, they begin to perish once Drogon destroys the blue heart. If the Undying ones are Whites, then the blue heart is an allegory for the heart of winter, from whence the others come. And perhaps the blue-eyed king is a Night's King figure, a Night King other, like in Game of Thrones, or perhaps King Stannis becoming a new Night's King like the one from Legend. You can watch my big Stannis video for more details on that theory, as well as Daenerys confronting him. Speaking of killing the masters, we have Arya. When the kindly man tells her the story of how the Faceless Men were founded, she vehemently disagrees with the first Faceless Man, who gave a slave the gift of mercy, aka death, instead of killing the slave masters responsible for their misery. The way Season 8 of Game of Thrones handled it was laughable and cheesy, but I won't be surprised if Arya has a hand in defeating the others, who, like Tormund says, are just another kind of master. However, Arya won't go off sailing west of Westeros after finally reuniting with her family. I think the biggest through line of Arya's story thus far is what Ned tells her in Book 1. The lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. Arya isn't better off being a loner assassin, a faceless man. She escapes Amory Lorch with her pack, Gendry and Hot Pie and Little Weasel. She escapes Harrenhal with her pack and the help of Jack and Hagar. She finds safety, for a time, with the Brotherhood, until the Hound snatches her away. Well, I like the idea of Arya linking back up with the Brotherhood, that pack of outlaws, as well as Nymeria and her literal pack of direwolves, and then Arya's own pack of Starks in Winterfell, helping Jon, Bran, maybe Rickon and Sansa through the long night together. As Vin Diesel says in the race car movies, it's about family. Family, family, family. All Daenerys wants is a family she never had. All Arya wants is a family taken away from her. And Jon wants answers about his own family. He has this recurring dream of the Winterfell crypt so often that George must have something planned down there. Perhaps it's where Jon will reckon with his self-admitted lust for Winterfell and discover the truth about his mother. No matter what though, Jon's a bastard, and George is flipping the reductive stereotype that all bastards are wanton and treacherous. Jon thinks about proving the stereotype wrong himself, but believes that if history remembers him at all, it would be as a turncloak, an oathbreaker, and a murderer. He was glad that Lord Eddard was not alive to see his shame. But we the reader know this isn't true. Jon the Bastard is a more noble protector of the weak and innocent than any true-born anointed knight. George is actually making the same point with Brienne. The world is too prejudiced to let her become an official knight, but she's already a better knight than any of them. The world expects Jon to be treacherous, but his treachery involves saving thousands of free folk and the girl he believes to be his sister, Arya. I'd also like to disavow Game of Thrones' ending for Jon, in which he's exiled from Westeros to go live beyond the wall with the wildlings. I think this is the opposite point George is trying to make. What message are you trying to send by having the free folk and Westerosi segregated once more at the end of the story? Jon's whole mission is to unite all the people of Westeros against their common enemy, so it would feel wrong to abandon that. Tyrion has already changed so much as a character that it's hard to say where he should end up based on themes and foreshadowing that George set up for him. We met Tyrion as this witty, womanizing scoundrel who was, ultimately, the most capable man in King's Landing despite his size. Instead of keeping his reviled dwarf sympathetic all the way through, George made the bold choice of actually turning Tyrion into the monster everyone already thought he was. In George's own words, Tyrion is now a villain. So he's got a choice. Either go all in on Tyrion's darkness, or pull him back from the brink of ruin. I think George is testing how far he can take a beloved character to the side of evil. A character who is ultimately on the right side of history. You can't ignore the vile acts Tyrion has made on a personal level, like murdering Shae, vowing to rape and murder Cersei, and raping the sex worker. I just mean on a grand scale, Tyrion is anti-Lannister, anti-slavery, and we can safely assume anti-others. In my opinion, Tyrion has gone too far to be redeemed, but perhaps spending some time with Daenerys will help him see that immense power can be used for good, that not everyone is selfish and out to get him. He's humbled in Essos by not having wealth or station for the first time in his life, putting him on an equal footing with the slaves Dany is trying to free. Literally, since Tyrion got sold into slavery. Tyrion has a soft spot for cripples, bastards, and broken things, and the irony is that he is all three: physically weak, reviled as much or more than a bastard, and an utterly broken human being. Perhaps by the end, George will show us that even terrible, broken people can still have a role to play in something larger than us all. If Jon's the bastard, and Tyrion is the broken thing, Bran is the cripple. George is writing about having the courage to live in the face of deformity and broken dreams. He can't be a great knight, he'll never be a Kingsguard, he'll never ride in tourneys and win glory on the battlefield. But what Bran can do, he must do. His edification at the wrinkly old hands of Bloodraven will have a direct impact on humanity defeating the others. Despite being physically abnormal, Bran's impact on the War for the Dawn will be just as large as Jon's and Dany's. Hacking and slashing with a magical sword, and burning people where they stand with magical dragons aren't the only ways to fight. Bran's connection to the Weirwoods will grant him intelligence. Whether it simply amounts to informing Jon where the others are marching, or it involves making some sort of pact with the children of the forest, or even with the others themselves, Bran will showcase the non-violent means of resistance. After all, A Song of Ice and Fire is jam-packed with anti-war messaging. George Martin himself conscientiously objected from Vietnam and thought the entire war was senseless. Born in the wake of World War II, his youth and adolescence during Korea and Vietnam, America's war on terror throughout his adult years. That's not to mention the ongoing tragedies currently dominating news cycles, Russia's offensive on Ukraine and Israel's genocide in Gaza. I doubt George has gotten any more sympathetic to the idea of concluding his series with one epic battle where the good guys win because they killed enough of the bad guys. Sure, George sometimes writes with a medieval romantic admiration for the glory of war, the heroics of great leaders. Events like Tyrion at the Blackwater, or Robert at the Ruby Ford, even Robb Stark's Linsanity run against the Lannisters. But ultimately, Tyrion's a horrible monster, Robert was horrible too and died embarrassingly, and Robb Stark died young as well. To survive, sometimes violence isn't the only solution. So a non-violent resolution to the series is one theme George has established and I'm reasonably confident will come true. For another core theme, we can actually just take a listen to George's own words. No subtext necessary here.
But the important thing is that, love and compassion and empathy with other human beings is still possible. Laughter is still possible, even laughter in the face of death. the struggle to make the world a better place. You know, we have things like war and murder and rape and horrible things that still exist in the world. There is darkness in the world, but I don't think we necessarily need to give way to despair. I mean, so winter is coming, but light the torches and drink the wine and gather around the fire. We can still defy it.
To paraphrase, even when facing horrible circumstances, never give way to despair. Gather together and defy it. This is why it makes sense for the Starks to come together again at Winterfell, for Daenerys to find her family, Jon Snow and perhaps Aegon to defy the Long Night together, for Tyrion to remember what it means to work bravely towards the right thing. He can gather up with his old buddy Jon, his new buddy Daenerys, and only together will they defy the others. I'd love to get even more specific and discuss the individual themes for all our POV characters, Jaime and Brienne and Cersei foremost amongst them, but I don't want to get bogged down by predicting the end for every character. That's what I do in most of my other videos, but here I want to express only the utmost important themes to the core of George Martin's story. If A Song of Ice and Fire ended in one volume, just as Gormenghast did, I've explained what I think George would want to include for his ending to be satisfying. Let me know your own thoughts on Martin's ethos and where his story is headed down below in the comments. If all we got was one more book, what should be included? And if my spoilers haven't deterred you, seek out Mervyn Peake's Titus books, and his other work for that matter, and help his genius live on. If you wish you had seen this video days ago, join my Patreon. All my videos are available on Patreon days and sometimes weeks before YouTube. And there's exclusive stuff too, like my current playthrough of Aegon's Conquest in CK2. It's $5 per month, and your direct support means the world to me. Thank you to all of these folks, and to you as well.